Flour dusted the scratched laminate counter like volcanic ash. Hollis didn't want to be a savior. He just wanted to bake his bread, survive the winter ration cuts, and forget the colony wars entirely. Then she walked in, an alien refugee, collarbones jutting violently against bruised violet-tinted skin, holding out a heavy, tarnished silver medal for a single loaf of stale sourdough. She was starving. He was nearly bankrupt. What happened next wasn't born of heroism. It was the stubborn, irrational gravity of being human. Dough stuck to Hollis's knuckles like wet cement. He scraped it off with a dull plastic bench knife, the sharp clack-clack of the tool echoing off the cracked tile walls of the empty shop. 4 in the morning. The chronometer above the industrial oven blinked a sickly, dying neon green. Outside, the sector known as New Providence was drowning in its usual misery. Heavy drops of chemical rain hammered the reinforced plexiglass of the storefront, carrying the distinct, bitter scent of sulfur and burnt engine oil through the poorly sealed window frames. Inside, however, the air was an assault of contradictory comfort. It smelled of life, fermenting yeast, warm salt water, caramelizing sugars. Hollis breathed it in, a shallow, rattling breath that caught in his chest. His lungs hadn't been the same since the atmospheric riots 3 years ago. He leaned his weight into the metal prep table, kneading the massive lump of rye dough. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. His forearms burned. They were mapped with pale, slick burn scars. The occupational hazard of wrestling iron racks out of a 400-degree oven while half awake. He was exhausted, not just the physical drain of a 12-hour shift, but a deep, marrow-deep fatigue. The war was supposedly over, but nobody on this rock had won anything. The government distributed synthetic nutrient paste to the masses, a grey slurry that tasted like damp cardboard. Hollis baked real bread. It was a stupid, expensive, dying art, but it was the only thing keeping him tethered to his sanity. Push, fold, turn. A sharp chime sliced through the low hum of the industrial refrigerators. Hollis paused, his hands buried deep in the pale, sticky dough. He didn't look up immediately. Nobody came to the bakery at 4 in the morning, unless they were drunk, lost, or dangerous. He wiped his hands on a filthy towel tied around his waist, flour billowing off the fabric like dry smoke. He reached under the counter, his fingers brushing the cold, heavy steel of the snub-nosed revolver he kept taped near the register. Just a precaution. New Providence wasn't kind to the unprepared. He finally lifted his gaze. Standing just inside the door, dripping filthy rainwater onto the cracked linoleum, was a girl. She wasn't human. That much was obvious immediately. Even under the oversized, rotting canvas trench coat that swallowed her frame, her skin was a dull, mottled violet, textured with micro scales along the jawline that caught the harsh fluorescent light. Her eyes were completely black, devoid of sclera, reflecting the neon bakery sign in twin, warped mirrors. Water pooled around her boots, heavy, military-issue boots that were 3 sizes too big, secured to her ankles with frayed electrical tape. Pinned to the lapel of her coat was a faded plastic transit tag from the Refugee Processing Center. In blocky, smeared English letters, someone had stamped the name Abigail, a Western designation assigned by a tired customs clerk who couldn't pronounce whatever her real name was. Hollis felt his jaw tighten. A refugee. He hated the refugee camps, not because he hated the aliens, but because the camps were a mirror held up to humanity's failures. They were a festering wound of disease and starvation just 3 miles down the highway, ignored by the politicians in the upper sectors. "We're closed," Hollis said. His voice was rough, scraping like sandpaper against the quiet room. "Open at 6. She didn't move. She didn't seem to hear him, or if she did, the translator implant at the base of her neck was malfunctioning. Her solid black eyes were locked entirely on the wire rack behind the counter. On the top shelf sat 3 loaves of sourdough left over from yesterday. They were dark, crusty, and entirely imperfect. Hollis watched her throat swallow. It was a hard, painful movement. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged rhythms. She looked incredibly brittle, as if a strong gust from the ventilation shaft might snap her spine. "Look, kid," Hollis muttered, softening his tone just a fraction, though irritation still spiked in his chest. He hated this. He hated the guilt that instantly flooded his veins. "I can't just give food away. The flour costs me double what it did last month. The yeast is smuggled in from the orbital stations. I'm barely keeping the lights on." It was the truth. He was 2 weeks behind on the lease. The local enforcement officers had already left a final notice taped to his back door. Abigail took a step forward. Her boot left a muddy, oil-stained footprint on the clean floor. She smelled like wet wet copper and old sweat, overpowering the delicate scent of the baking bread. Her hand, trembling violently, emerged from the oversized sleeve of the coat. She had 4 digits, long and double-jointed. She pointed a single dirt-caked finger at the day-old sourdough. "Hungry?" she whispered. The word was heavily synthesized, grinding through the cheap vocal translator clamped to her collarbone. It sounded metallic, stripped of any organic emotion, yet the sheer physical desperation radiating from her body hit Hollis like a physical blow. He closed his eyes for a second, rubbing the bridge of his nose with a flour-caked thumb. He was a cynical man. He had learned to be. You didn't survive in New Providence by bleeding your heart out for every stray that wandered out of the acid rain. You survived by looking down, doing your job, and locking your doors. But he was a baker, and baking, at its absolute core, was the act of feeding people. It was a stupid, persistent contradiction that tore at him every single day. Hollis sighed. A long, defeated sound. He turned around, grabbed a square of brown parchment paper, and pulled one of the dark sourdough loaves from the rack. The crust crackled under his grip. It was heavy, dense, good bread. 2 credits, Hollis said, slapping the wrapped loaf onto the glass counter. He kept his voice flat, devoid of pity. Pity was insulting. "You got 2 credits, kid?" Abigail stared at the wrapped loaf. For a moment, she stopped breathing entirely. Her large black eyes darted from the bread up to Hollis's face, searching his weary, lined expression for a trap. In the camps, nothing was freely offered, and every transaction had hidden teeth. She didn't have 2 credits. Hollis knew she didn't. The transit tag on her chest marked her as a Class 4, displaced non-combatant. She wasn't legally allowed to hold local currency. Slowly, her 4-fingered hand retreated into the deep, ragged pocket of the military coat. Hollis stiffened instinctively. His hand drifted back down below the counter, hovering inches from the grip of the revolver. Adrenaline, sour and sharp, spiked in the back of his throat. Desperate people did desperate things. If she pulled a shiv or a stolen plasma cutter, he would have to defend himself. He hated the thought, hated the sudden tension that ruined the sanctuary of his kitchen. But survival was a hard reflex to break. Her hand emerged, not with a weapon. Her fingers were curled tightly around something small and metallic. She reached across the counter, her wrist shaking so badly the bones clicked softly, and placed the object on the scratched glass. It landed with a dense, resonant thud. The sound was impossibly heavy for its size. Hollis didn't reach for it right away. He stared at it. It was a medal. Not a cheap plastic commendation or a stamped tin souvenir. It was a solid block of what looked like raw, unpolished osmium, shaped into a jagged, asymmetrical starburst. In the center, set into the dark metal, was a single piece of amber glass, glowing faintly with a residual radioactive heat. The ribbon attached to it was shredded, woven from a stiff synthetic fiber that was stained deeply with something rust-colored and organic, old blood. Hollis knew exactly what it was. Every human who had watched the broadcast of the siege of the Outer Rim knew what it was. It was a Sun Cross, the highest military honor of her species. It wasn't given for surviving, it was given for dying. It meant whoever had originally worn that medal had stood their ground until the very bitter, violent end, ensuring others could escape. It was the equivalent of a posthumous Medal of Honor, steeped in profound cultural reverence. Abigail pushed it an inch closer to him. Her finger lingered on the cold metal for a fraction of a second, tracing the edge of the amber center, before she pulled her hand back entirely. She looked at the bread. "Payment," her translator buzzed, a flat, robotic monotone that completely failed to capture the monumental sacrifice of the gesture. Hollis felt his stomach drop. A cold, suffocating weight settled in his chest. He stared at the medal. On the black market in the lower sectors, an authentic Sun Cross forged of raw osmium would sell for a small fortune. Collectors from the inner systems paid thousands of credits for war memorabilia. It would pay his back rent. It would buy him a new industrial mixer. It would fix the atmospheric scrubbers in his apartment. It was a lifeline. All he had to do was take it. Take the absolute last shred of this alien girl's heritage, the physical proof of her family's ultimate sacrifice, and give her a 2-credit loaf of day-old bread in return. Hollis swallowed. His throat felt like it was packed with dry sand. He looked from the heavy, blood-stained medal to Abigail's face. She wasn't crying. Her species didn't produce tears, but her shoulders were curled inward, braced for the theft, completely resigned to the brutal arithmetic of survival. She was trading her soul for flour and water because a soul couldn't stop her ribs from aching. "No," Hollis said. The word cracked in the quiet bakery. Abigail flinched, pulling back slightly as if he had struck her. Her eyes widened, a flicker of raw panic breaking through her exhausted stoicism. She thought he was refusing the trade. She thought he was denying her the food. "No," Hollis repeated, his voice firmer this time. He stepped away from the cash register. He reached out and picked up the heavy, cold medal. It felt immense in his palm, dense with a tragic gravity. He reached across the counter, grabbed her thin, freezing hand, and pressed the osmium star back into her palm, folding her long, unnatural fingers over it. Her skin was ice-cold and rough, like fine grit sandpaper. "I don't take foreign currency," Hollis lied. His voice was gruff, deliberately harsh to mask the sudden, humiliating tightness in his throat. "Keep your junk." Before she could process the rejection, Hollis picked up the wrapped loaf of sourdough and shoved it hard against her chest. "Take it," he barked, turning away quickly. He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he might acknowledge his own vulnerability, and he couldn't afford that right now. "It's stale anyway. I was going to throw it out for the vermin. Get it out of my shop." He grabbed his plastic bench knife and fiercely attacked the dough on the prep table, scraping and cutting with unnecessary violence. Clack, clack, clack. Behind him there was silence. Then the horrific, wet sound of tearing crust. He glanced over his shoulder. Abigail wasn't leaving. She had dropped to her knees right there on the dirty linoleum, the parchment paper ripped to shreds. She was eating. It wasn't a dignified sight. She tore into the dense bread like a feral animal, her jaw unhinging slightly, swallowing massive chunks without chewing. Crumbs cascaded down her rotting coat. She choked, coughed violently, and shoved another handful into her mouth. It was ugly. It was raw. It broke Hollis's heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He didn't offer her water. He didn't offer a kind word or a gentle hand on the shoulder. He just turned his back, staring blankly at the wall as he mechanically kneaded the rye, letting the loud, rhythmic thud of his work cover the sound of a starving girl sobbing dryly into a loaf of bread. He refused her medal, but he couldn't fix her world. He could only bake, and tomorrow he would bake a little more. Crumbs littered the cracked linoleum like dirty snow. Down on her knees, Abigail stared at her empty hands. Her chest heaved. The sudden influx of dense carbohydrates into a starving system was a violent shock, and her violet skin flushed with a strange mottled gray under the fluorescent lights. She coughed, a harsh, rattling sound that ended in a mechanical wheeze from her damaged translator collar. Hollis kept his back to her. He focused on the dough. Push, fold, turn. He leaned into the rhythm, using the physical exertion to drown out the suffocating awkwardness filling his shop. He wanted her to leave. He had given her what she wanted, what she needed, and now the transaction was supposed to be over. That was how New Providence worked. You survived your 15 minutes, you took your scrap, and you disappeared back into the smog. Minutes dragged. The heavy industrial ovens behind him clicked, the gas burners roaring to life with a hollow whoosh as they hit 450 degrees. Radiant heat washed over his back, soaking into his sweat-stained shirt. She wasn't leaving. Hollis paused, his flour-coated hands resting on the stainless steel prep table. He ground his teeth together. "Rain's letting up," he lied gruffly, not turning around. "Shelters open at 5 for the morning ration. You want a cot? You better start walking." Behind him, the heavy, wet rustle of canvas shifted. Footsteps, but they didn't move toward the front door. They moved closer to the counter. Hollis finally turned, wiping his brow with the back of a wrist. Abigail stood beside the glass display case. She was standing straighter now. The violent tremors had stopped, replaced by a rigid, unnatural stillness. Her completely black eyes locked onto his, unblinking. She reached up to her throat, tapping a sequence against the bruised skin near her translator. "Debt incurred," the machine spat. The synthetic voice was louder this time, devoid of inflection, but heavy with intent. Hollis frowned, grabbing a damp rag and furiously wiping down his bench knife. "There's no debt. I told you the bread was stale, trash. I threw it away. You caught it. Now get out of my kitchen before the sector patrol tags us both for unauthorized loitering." She didn't budge. She pointed a long, multi-jointed finger at her own chest, then at the floor beneath her boots. "Debt incurred," the translator repeated. "Unpaid balance. Honor binds." "I don't care about your honor," Hollis snapped, his voice rising, bouncing harshly off the tiled walls. His chest tightened with a familiar, suffocating panic. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be responsible for another breathing thing. "I don't want your medal. I don't want your money. I run a bakery, not a charity, and not a damn refugee employment program. Out!" He pointed the plastic knife toward the glass door. Outside, the chemical rain hadn't stopped at all. It was coming down harder, thick, and acidic, hissing against the cracked pavement and turning the gutter into a toxic, churning river. The streetlights flickered, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the flooded road. If she walked out there in that rotting coat, the cold would drop her core temperature to fatal levels before she made it half a mile. Hollis stared at the rain. He stared at the yellow shadows. He cursed. He cursed the city. He cursed the war, and he cursed whatever broken piece of his brain still gave a damn. Throwing his rag onto the counter with a loud, wet smack, he marched past her. Abigail flinched, bracing her shoulders as if expecting a physical blow, but Hollis only stomped over to the front door and threw the deadbolt. Clack! He yanked the heavy iron security grate down over the window, plunging the front half of the shop into shadow. "You want to pay a debt?" Hollis growled, storming back toward the kitchen. He didn't look at her. "Fine, but you stay out of sight. The local enforcers catch a Class 4 alien past the checkpoint without a labor permit. They'll break your legs and fine me 3 months' rent. Come here." He walked over to the deep industrial sinks in the far corner of the back room. Piled high against the wall was a mountain of blackened, grease-caked baking sheets from the past 3 days. He hadn't had the energy to scrub them. "Hot water, steel wool, lye soap," Hollis instructed, pointing to the supplies. He grabbed a thick rubber apron off a hook and practically threw it at her. "You scrub until you see silver. You miss a corner, you do it again. You understand?" Abigail caught the apron. It swallowed her entirely, dragging on the floor. She looked at the mountain of pans, then down at the harsh lye soap. Slowly, she looked back at Hollis. She didn't say a word. She just nodded. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the bakery were the rhythmic hissing of the ovens, the soft thump of Hollis kneading dough, and the violent, relentless scraping of steel wool against aluminum in the back corner. Hollis tried to ignore her. He focused on shaping the baguettes, scoring the tops with a razor blade. But every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the sink. She worked with a frantic, terrifying intensity. Her long fingers gripped the steel wool so hard her knuckles turned a pale, sickly white. The scalding water splashed over her wrists, but she didn't react to the heat. She scrubbed, as if her life depended on it, stripping years of baked-on grease away with brute, mechanical force. She was trying to earn the bread. She was trying to prove she wasn't a beggar. Hollis watched her plunge another pan into the steaming water. He felt a dull ache behind his eyes. He realized then that she hadn't just offered him the medal because she was starving. She had offered it because it was the only thing of value she had left to prove she still existed, and by refusing it, he had stripped her of her agency. He had turned an exchange of equals into an act of pity. He turned back to his cutting board. "Don't bend the rims," he muttered quietly into the empty room. From the sink, the frantic scraping slowed down just a fraction, a silent acknowledgement. They were 2 ghosts haunting a kitchen, bound by a stale loaf of bread and a debt neither of them knew how to settle. Sickly yellow dawn bled through the edges of the security grate, signaling the start of another brutal shift. 6 in the morning. Hollis unlocked the front door and flipped the neon open sign. The hum of the cheap electrical ballast joined the low rumble of the street outside. The morning rush in New Providence wasn't a line of cheerful commuters grabbing coffee. It was a procession of exhausted dock workers, night shift medics, and grim-faced mechanics pulling their collars up against the chemical smog. They moved like cattle, counting small metal coins with grease-stained fingers. Hollis stood behind the counter, a fresh apron tied around his waist, bagging warm rolls and trading them for handfuls of tarnished credits. The air smelled of sharp yeast and hot crust, a momentary shield against the ozone and rotting garbage outside. "Too rye, Hollis," grunted a heavy-set man in a patched synthetic jacket. His breath smelled of cheap alcohol and synthetic tobacco. 4 credits, Briggs, Hollis replied evenly, sliding the paper bag across the glass. Behind him, separated only by a swinging wooden door, Abigail was quietly sorting 50-pound sacks of flour. Hollis had told her to stay out of sight, and to her credit she moved with complete silence. Despite her starved frame, her species possessed a dense, fibrous muscle structure. He had watched her lift a sack of unbleached wheat flour that would have strained his own back, hoisting it over her shoulder without a single gasp for air. The bell above the door violently jingled. Hollis looked up. The low murmur of the bakery instantly died. The 3 customers waiting in line went rigid, instinctively stepping back, their eyes dropping to the floor. Donovan walked in. He didn't wear a uniform, but the heavy, military-grade kinetic pistol strapped to his thigh communicated his authority perfectly. Donovan was a collection enforcer for the district magistrate. He was a tall man, entirely too clean for this sector, wearing a tailored synth-leather coat that repelled the city's grime. His eyes were pale, calculating, and completely devoid of empathy. "Smells good in here, Baker," Donovan said, his boots clicking sharply on the linoleum. He bypassed the line entirely, stepping right up to the counter. He rested his hands on the glass, looking down at the fresh pastries. "Smells like a man who can afford his local transit tax." Hollis felt his jaw lock. The transit tax was an extortion racket, plain and simple. The magistrate squeezed the independent businesses to fund the local enforcement patrols. "I paid the tax last month, Donovan," Hollis said, keeping his hands visible on the counter. "I'm current." Rates went up. Donovan smiled, a thin, razor-like expression. "Security is getting expensive. The refugee camps are spilling over, vermin crawling up into the civilized sectors. We have to double the patrols to keep the streets clean." Hollis swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. "How much?" 200 credits. It was a death sentence. 200 credits was his entire margin for the week. It was the flour order. It was the electricity bill. Hollis gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. "I don't have it," Hollis said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. "I have 50 in the register. That's it." Donovan sighed, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "That's a shame, Hollis. You know the magistrate hates closing down legitimate businesses. Maybe I should take a look in the back. See if there's any equipment we can impound against your debt. An industrial mixer, perhaps?" Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Hollis's chest. Abigail was in the back. If Donovan saw a Class 4 alien loitering in a human business without a permit, he wouldn't just fine Hollis. He would drag her out into the street, and Hollis would never see her again. "Stay out of my kitchen," Hollis barked, taking a step to block the swinging door. Donovan's eyes narrowed. His hand dropped lazily toward the grip of his pistol. "Are you telling me how to do my job, Baker?" Before Hollis could react, the swinging door squeaked open. Hollis's heart stopped. Abigail stepped out from the back. She had taken off the oversized canvas coat. Underneath, she wore a tattered, sleeveless gray undershirt that clung to her emaciated frame. Her violet skin was covered in flour dust. But what caught the eye wasn't the dirt. It was the intricate, raised scars mapping her bare arms, burn marks, plasma scoring, the undeniable brutal geography of the orbital front lines. She held a massive cast-iron skillet in one hand, gripping it by the handle. She didn't raise it. She just held it loosely at her side. Her completely black eyes locked onto Donovan. The silence in the bakery was absolute. The customers held their breath. Donovan stared at her. He looked at the alien, then at the heavy iron pan, and finally at the raw, unblinking intensity in her gaze. She wasn't human, but the predator standing in front of him translated perfectly across species. She had survived things Donovan couldn't even imagine, and she looked entirely ready to cave his skull in over a bakery floor. "Well," Donovan muttered, taking a slow half-step backward. His hand slid away from his gun. He wasn't paid enough to fight a cornered war veteran, human or otherwise. He looked back at Hollis, his arrogant smile replaced by a tight, nervous sneer. "Looks like you've got an infestation, Baker. 50 credits. Put it on the glass. I'll be back next week for the rest." Hollis didn't say a word. He popped the register, pulled out 5 tarnished 10-credit chips, and dropped them on the counter. Donovan snatched them up. He gave Abigail one last wary glance before turning on his heel and marching out into the rain. The door slammed shut behind him. The remaining customers quickly dropped their coins, grabbed their bread, and scuttled out, eager to distance themselves from the tension. Hollis was left alone with her. He let out a long, shuddering breath, leaning back against the wall. His legs felt like lead. He looked at Abigail. She was still holding the iron pan, her chest rising and falling rhythmically. "I told you to stay out of sight," Hollis said, his voice completely hollowed out by adrenaline. Abigail slowly lowered the pan. She reached up to her collar. "Debt incurred," the translator buzzed softly. "Partial payment rendered." Hollis stared at her. He looked at the flour dusting her scarred violet arms, at the stubborn tilt of her chin. He ran a hand over his face, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. He wasn't a hero. He was a broke baker with a target on his back, and now apparently he had an alien bodyguard. "Get back to the sink," Hollis muttered, turning toward the ovens. "And don't break my pans." Flour dust settled over the kitchen in a permanent pale film, coating the harsh reality of their arrangement in a soft white haze. Over the next 11 days, Abigail transitioned from a starving ghost in the corner to an undeniable fixture in the bakery's brutal ecosystem. She didn't speak. Her translator remained switched off to conserve its dying internal battery, leaving only the sharp, rhythmic sounds of manual labor to fill the silence between them. Hollis didn't know what to do with her. He was a creature of bitter isolation, accustomed to the predictable company of yeast and heat. Having another body in the cramped prep area threw off his rhythm. He bumped into her. She bumped into him, but she learned fast. Her alien physiology, built for a gravity much heavier than this planet's, made the back-breaking work look terrifyingly effortless. 50-pound sacks of raw orbital wheat were tossed onto the storage pallets like pillows, When the ancient industrial dough mixer jammed, grinding its gears with a horrifying screech that smelled of burning copper wire, Abigail simply reached her long, double-jointed arm into the access panel and forced the seized rotor back into alignment with a sickening crunch of metal. Hollis had stared at her, half expecting the machine to explode. Instead, it hummed back to life, the motor purring smoother than it had in a decade. She had wiped grease from her violet knuckles onto her ragged apron, giving him a flat, unblinking look before returning to the sink. They found a strange equilibrium in the work. Baking was an exact science, but it was also a tactile language. Hollis couldn't explain the subtle hydration ratios of a sourdough starter to a non-human refugee who didn't speak English, so he showed her. He dumped a massive mound of sticky, fermented rye onto the wooden bench. The smell was intense, sharp, alcoholic, and deeply sour, like bruised apples left in the sun. He pointed to his hands, heavily dusted with flour, and then to the dough. Push, fold, turn. Abigail watched. Her solid black eyes tracked his movements with predatory focus. When he stepped back, wiping his brow, she stepped forward. Her four-fingered hands were clumsy at first. She applied too much downward force, her fibrous muscles crushing the delicate air pockets trapped within the gluten structure. The dough tore, turning into a dense, unworkable paste. Frustration radiated off her. Her jaw clenched, the microscales along her neck shifting and clicking in rapid succession. She reached up to turn on her translator, her fingers trembling with the familiar shame of failure. Hollis caught her wrist. He didn't grip it hard, he just stopped the motion. Her skin was still rough, but the freezing, corpse-like chill was gone, replaced by a steady, thrumming warmth. She was eating now, 2 full meals a day, composed mostly of broken pastries and dense protein scraps he traded bread for at the butcher 2 blocks over. "Don't kill it," Hollis grunted, pulling her hand away from the metal collar. He pointed at the torn dough. "It's alive. Yeast breathes. You crush it. You suffocate it. You have to guide it. Use the heel of your hand, not your shoulders." He stood beside her, their shoulders inches apart. He mimed the motion in the air, smooth, rolling. Abigail stared at his hands, then down at her own. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, she adjusted her stance, shifting her weight off her heavy combat boots. She pressed her palms into the fresh mound of dough Hollis slid over. Push, fold, turn. It was gentler this time. She stretched the gluten matrix without breaking it, folding the pale mass over itself and trapping the air inside. Her long fingers, previously weapons of brute force, adapted to the delicate tension of the dough. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate in her chest. It wasn't a vocalization. It was a physical purr, a subconscious alien response to the repetitive, grounding nature of the task. Hollis watched her, a strange, heavy knot forming in his throat. He looked away, focusing violently on scoring a tray of baguettes. He couldn't afford to care. Caring was a luxury that got people killed in New Providence. The illusion of their sanctuary shattered 30 minutes later. Outside on the rain-slicked avenue, a heavy transport skiff hit a pothole. Its overloaded exhaust manifold backfired. Crack! The sound was identical to high-velocity kinetic sniper fire. In a fraction of a second, the dough on the table was abandoned. Abigail didn't just flinch. Her combat instincts hijacked her nervous system. She hit the floor with terrifying speed, diving under the heavy steel prep table. She curled into a tight, defensive ball, her hands wrapped protectively over the back of her neck, her breathing shallow and ragged. The purr in her chest vanished, replaced by a silent, violent panic. Hollis froze, his razor blade hovering over a loaf of bread. He looked under the table. She was shaking. The tough, unyielding veteran who had intimidated a corrupt enforcer just days ago was gone, replaced by a terrified survivor drowning in a flashback. Hollis didn't pull her out. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her she was safe. Telling a refugee they were safe was a lie they both knew better than to believe. Instead, he reached over to the drying rack, grabbed a heavy aluminum baking sheet, and deliberately dropped it onto the tile floor. Clang! The sharp, chaotic metallic noise drowned out the echo of the backfire. Abigail gasped, her black eyes snapping open, anchoring to the sheet metal skittering across the floor. "Drop the tray, pick it up," Hollis growled, his voice loud, rough, and entirely ordinary. He tossed a wet rag directly at her face. It hit her shoulder and fell into her lap. "Floor needs wiping. Flour gets wet. It turns to cement. Move. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned his back and aggressively slid a rack of bread into the roaring oven. He listened. Slowly, the shaking stopped. The rustle of canvas echoed from under the table. Abigail crawled out, gripping the wet rag. She didn't look at him, but she immediately dropped to her knees and began scrubbing the flour dust off the linoleum, her breathing evening out with every harsh, abrasive stroke. He gave her a task, and the task kept the ghosts away. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Midnight brought the smugglers. Heavy rhythmic thuds rattled the reinforced steel of the alleyway loading dock. Hollis unlocked the deadbolt, sliding the heavy bar back with a rusted screech. Rain instantly blew into the corridor, carrying the sharp chemical stench of the lower sector refineries. Standing in the deluge was Finch. Finch was a rat of a man, thin and twitchy, wearing a rubberized poncho that dripped toxic water onto Hollis's clean floor. He was the only supplier in the district who still smuggled unbleached orbital grain past the magistrate's checkpoints. He charged a premium, but his flour didn't taste like synthetic chalk. 3 bags, Finch hissed, pushing a heavy anti-grav dolly over the threshold. 50 pounds each. You owe me 80 credits, Baker. Cash only. The transit guards are raising their bribe rates. Hollis grabbed the handles of the dolly, his muscles straining against the immense weight as he pulled it inside. 80 is robbery, Finch. We agreed on 65. That was last week, Finch snapped, his eyes darting nervously toward the alley before he slammed the steel door shut. He leaned against it, wiping wet, oily hair out of his eyes. Be glad I showed up at all. The upper sectors are locking down. The magistrate just issued a zero-tolerance mandate. They're clearing the streets. Hollis stopped pushing the dolly. A cold, leaden weight dropped into his stomach. Clearing what streets? All of them, Finch coughed, a wet, sickly sound. He pulled a flask from his coat, taking a ragged swig. They claim there was a riot in the Class 4 processing camps. 3 guards injured. The magistrate authorized sweeping the local business blocks. Any alien off-camp without a chained labor permit is getting rounded up. No fines, no warnings. They're throwing them onto transit barges and sending them to the lithium mines on the outer moons. Hollis felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. The lithium mines weren't a penal colony. They were an execution sentence carried out over 6 agonizing months of radiation poisoning. When? Hollis asked, his voice deceptively flat. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever the enforcers feel like kicking doors down, Finch replied, holding out a grimy hand. 80 credits, Hollis. Pay me so I can get back underground before the patrols sweep this sector. Hollis didn't argue. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his apron, counted out the tarnished metal chips, and slapped them into Finch's palm. The smuggler didn't bother counting them. He just nodded tightly, popped the door open, and vanished back into the heavy rain. Hollis locked the deadbolt. He stood in the dim corridor for a long time, the hum of the ovens the only sound keeping him anchored to the floor. He pushed the dolly into the kitchen. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered. Abigail was waiting. She stood by the prep table. She had heard everything. Her translator was on, the small green light blinking softly against her bruised collarbone. She wasn't wearing her apron. She had put her oversized, rotting canvas trench coat back on. It was completely dry now, but it still looked like a shroud. Her bag was packed. It consisted of a single, frayed plastic sack containing the heel of a stale loaf and a jar of clean water Hollis had left by her cot in the storage room. Hollis stopped the dolly. The wheels squeaked loudly in the silence. No, Hollis said. The word felt heavy, sinking to the floor between them. Abigail didn't look at him. She reached into her deep pocket. Her hand emerged, her 4 double-jointed fingers curled tightly. She stepped forward and placed the object on the steel table. Thud. The Sun Cross medal gleamed darkly under the cheap lights. The amber glass in the center completely dead, devoid of the radioactive glow it had possessed days ago. It was just a cold piece of osmium now. Debt incurred, a translator buzzed, the synthetic voice echoing off the tile. Lodging, rations, protection, balance paid, honor binds. She was leaving. She was going to walk out the front door, directly into the toxic rain and the waiting guns of the magistrate's enforcers, to ensure Hollis's bakery wasn't caught in the crossfire. She was sacrificing herself for a man who had yelled at her, overworked her, and refused to look her in the eye for over a week. Hollis stared at the medal. He felt an intense, violent surge of anger, not at her, at the city, at the war, at the absolute, crushing unfairness of a universe that forced a decorated veteran to buy her right to exist with scrap metal and stale bread. "Pick it up," Hollis commanded, his voice trembling with a rage he couldn't entirely control. Abigail flinched. She tapped her chest. "Payment rendered." "I said pick it up," Hollis roared, slamming his heavy fist against the steel table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. The medal jumped. Abigail shrank back, her black eyes widening in shock. She reached out, her her fingers trembling, and snatched the cold metal from the table. Hollis breathed heavily, his chest heaving. He wiped his face with a flour-caked hand, leaving a stark white smear across his cheek. He marched across the kitchen, grabbing her by the thick canvas collar of her coat. He didn't pull her toward the back door. He pulled her toward the massive, walk-in, dry storage pantry. "You don't walk out of my kitchen until the shift is over," Hollis snarled, dragging her past the towering stacks of flour. He kicked a stack of empty plastic delivery crates out of the way, revealing a rusted iron grate bolted to the floor, the old ventilation access to the sub-basement. He yanked it open. The smell of damp earth and old concrete wafted up. "Get down there," Hollis ordered, pointing into the dark hole. "You don't make a sound. You don't turn on that translator. If Donovan or any of his jackbooted thugs come through that door, I will handle them, but you do not leave." Abigail stared at the hole, then back up at Hollis. For the first time, the rigid military discipline in her posture broke. Her lower lip, lined with tiny scales, trembled. She looked at the medal in her hand, then at the baker who was risking a death sentence for a Class 4 alien he barely knew. "Why?" her translator whispered softly. Hollis looked at her. He looked at the burn scars on her arms, the bruising on her neck, and the desperate, starving humanity buried behind her completely alien eyes. "Because I'm out of yeast," Hollis lied roughly, pushing her gently toward the grate. "And I need you to mix the starter tomorrow. Now get in the hole." Scraping plastic across concrete felt louder than a bomb going off. Hollis dragged 3 empty delivery crates over the rusted iron grate, his breath tearing through his ruined lungs in ragged, uneven gasps. He didn't stop there. He grabbed the nearest 50-pound sacks of unbleached rye, hauling them off the pallet and dropping them violently over the crates. 1, 2, 3. The heavy thuds masked the subtle squeak of the ancient hinges beneath the floorboards. He grabbed his broom, furiously sweeping a thick layer of white flour over the seams, destroying any trace of the drag marks. His hands were shaking, not with the steady, familiar ache of muscle fatigue, but with the sharp, acidic tremor of raw adrenaline. He stood up, leaning against the cold, stainless steel of the prep table. He closed his eyes and inhaled. The air was wrong. Beneath the overwhelming scent of yeast and sourdough, there was a faint metallic tang, wet copper and ozone. It was Abigail's sweat, baked into the humidity of the cramped kitchen. To a casual customer, it would mean nothing. To a trained sector enforcer looking for a Class 4 alien, it was a flashing neon sign. Hollis cursed under his breath. He lunged toward the massive industrial ovens. He cranked the master temperature dial to a blistering 500 degrees, then grabbed a plastic deli container filled with raw, dark brown sugar. He didn't measure. He just hurled a massive handful directly past the baking stones, letting it hit the exposed heating coils at the bottom of the chamber. The reaction was instantaneous. The sugar liquefied, hissed, and immediately began to burn. Thick, acrid smoke poured out of the oven vents, smelling of charred molasses and bitter carbon. It was suffocating. It completely eradicated the scent of wet copper. Hollis slammed the oven door shut, coughing harshly into his elbow, his eyes watering from the harsh smoke. Outside the storefront, the deep, mechanical hum of an armored transit vehicle vibrated through the rain-slicked pavement. The screech of air brakes cut through the storm. They didn't knock. The heavy iron security grate rattled violently as someone took a mechanized battering ram to the front door. The lock snapped with a sharp, metallic crack. The hinges groaned, and the heavy plexiglass door was kicked open, slamming against the interior wall hard enough to shatter a framed health certificate. Hollis walked out from the swinging kitchen doors, wiping his flour-coated hands on his apron. He forced his heart rate down. He forced his face into the mask of an exhausted, severely inconvenienced local business owner. 3 men stepped into the bakery. They weren't beat cops like Donovan. These were tactical sweep officers. They wore heavy, matte black ballistic armor, their faces obscured by the harsh glare of tactical flashlights mounted to the barrels of short-barreled kinetic rifles. Water dripped from their helmets, pooling instantly on the clean linoleum. The lead officer stepped forward, sweeping the beam of his rifle across the empty display cases. His name tag bolted to his chest plate read Gage. "Sector lockdown," Gage barked, his voice amplified and distorted by the helmet's external speaker. "All undocumented non-citizens are being relocated. Step away from the counter, Baker. Hands where I can see them." Hollis didn't raise his hands, but he placed them flat on the glass display case, keeping his fingers splayed. "You broke my lock," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I paid my transit tax. I paid Donovan yesterday. You have no right to break my door." "Martial law supersedes local extortion," Gage replied flatly. He didn't even look at Hollis. He gestured to the 2 officers behind him. "Tear it apart. Check the ceiling tiles. Check the deep freezers. The two officers bypassed the counter, their heavy boots tracking mud and dirty water directly into the kitchen. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in Hollis's stomach. He kept his face completely blank. If he showed an ounce of fear, Gage would smell it. "There's nobody here but me," Hollis said, coughing again as the burnt sugar smoke drifted from the back room into the storefront. "I run this place alone. You're wasting your time, and you're letting all my heat out." Gage finally turned to look at him. The officer stepped closer, stopping inches from the glass counter. He pushed his helmet visor up, revealing a scarred, completely unsympathetic face. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "Smells like hell in here," Gage muttered. "Oven thermostat is busted," Hollis lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "Coils run hot, burns the sugar on the bottom trays. I've been waiting 3 months for the magistrate to approve the import permit for a replacement part." Gage stared at him. He was looking for the twitch, the nervous swallow, the darting eyes. Hollis gave him nothing. He just stared back with the dull, hollow resentment of a man who worked 80 hours a week and had nothing left to lose. A loud crash echoed from the kitchen. One of the officers had knocked over a rack of cooling racks. Metal clattered violently against the tile. "Hey!" Hollis shouted, his anger entirely genuine this time. "Watch the equipment! That's calibrated steel!" Gage smirked, clearly amused by the baker's frustration. "Relax, old man. We're just doing our job." The officer slowly unholstered a heavy, high-lumen flashlight from his belt. He tapped the thick glass of the display case with the heavy metal casing, leaving a small scratch. "Let's go take a look at these broken ovens," Gage said, pushing past the counter and shoving the swinging wooden doors open. Hollis followed, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He walked into the kitchen. The room was a disaster. The enforcers had pulled the bags of unbleached flour off the pallets, tearing 2 of them open and spilling 100 pounds of white powder across the wet floor. The sink had been checked. The deep freezer had been emptied, its contents thrown onto the floor to melt. Gage walked directly toward the dry storage pantry, right toward the mountain of rye sacks stacked over the floor grate. Heavy boots crunched over the spilled flour. Gage stopped at the threshold of the dry storage pantry, sweeping his flashlight over the towering shelves of canned yeast, salt blocks, and the haphazard pile of rye sacks in the corner. Under the floorboards, beneath the stacked crates and the heavy grain, Abigail was buried in absolute darkness. If she coughed, if she shifted her weight, if her broken translator emitted even the faintest electronic hum, it was over. They would execute her in the alley and burn the bakery to the ground. Hollis stood near the prep table, his hands gripping the edge of the stainless steel so hard his knuckles ached. He watched Gage step into the pantry. The officer kicked the bottom of a plastic crate. It shifted, scraping loudly against the iron grate underneath. "Lot of grain for a guy who runs a shop alone," Gage noted, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. He reached out and grabbed the corner of the top sack of rye, testing its weight. Hollis knew the exact second Gage decided to move the bags. It was in the sudden, deliberate shift of the man's shoulders. The enforcer was thorough. He wasn't going to leave the corner unchecked. Hollis had less than 3 seconds. He didn't think, he reacted. He spun toward the massive industrial oven to his left. The master temperature dial was still pinned at 500 degrees. On the side of the unit, painted a faded caution yellow, was the manual steam injection lever. It was designed to release a controlled burst of humidity into the baking chamber to create a crust on the bread. But if the oven was empty, and the coils were superheated with burning sugar, the pressure was completely unregulated. Hollis grabbed the heavy iron lever and yanked it down with all his strength. Screesh! The sound was deafening, like a high-speed train locking its brakes. A massive, violent cloud of superheated 400-degree steam exploded from the oven vents. It didn't just drift. It blasted across the kitchen with explosive force, carrying the blinding, choking smoke of the charred sugar directly into the dry storage pantry. "Christ!" Gage bellowed, dropping his flashlight as the scalding wall of steam hit him. The 2 other enforcers stumbled backward, throwing their hands over their exposed faces, hacking violently as the bitter carbon coated the back of their throats. The kitchen was instantly plunged into a thick, impenetrable gray fog. The heat was completely unbearable. "Vent stuck," Hollis roared over the hissing machinery, acting out the panic flawlessly. He grabbed a heavy, wet towel and threw it over his own face, diving toward the oven. "Valve blew! Get back or it'll strip the skin off your face!" He slammed the lever back up, shutting off the water line, but the damage was done. The entire back half of the bakery was a humid, choking nightmare. The visibility was 0. The air burned to breathe. Gage stumbled out of the pantry, colliding hard with the prep table. He was cursing relentlessly swatting at the thick air, his eyes entirely squeezed shut against the stinging vapor. "Clear out!" Gage yelled to his men, his voice cracking into a ragged cough. "The whole block is toxic! Move!" The enforcers didn't hesitate. They scrambled out of the kitchen, their boots slipping on the wet, flour-caked floor. Gage was the last one out. He paused at the swinging doors, pointing a blind, gloved finger in Hollis's general direction. "Get this hazard fixed, Baker," Gage growled, wiping soot and condensation from his face. "Next time I come in here, I'm shutting you down." He turned and shoved his way out of the storefront. A moment later, the heavy hum of the armored transport roared to life. The tires squealed against the wet pavement, and the vehicle tore off down the flooded avenue. Hollis didn't move. He stood in the suffocating heat, the wet towel still pressed against his mouth. He listened. The rain hit the roof. The oven ticked, slowly cooling down. The street was empty. His legs suddenly gave out. He collapsed against the prep table, sliding down the stainless steel legs until he hit the floor. The adrenaline completely left his system, leaving him hollow, shaking, and nauseous. He sat there in the spilled flour and the charred sugar for a long time, staring blindly into the thinning fog. Slowly, painfully, he forced himself up. He walked over to the dry storage pantry. The air was still searing hot, but the steam was dissipating through the ventilation hoods. He gripped the heavy sacks of rye and dragged them off the crates. He pulled the plastic boxes aside. The iron grate was covered in a thick paste of wet flour. Hollis dug his fingers into the heavy rusted iron loops and pulled. The grate groaned, lifting up and clanging against the concrete wall. He looked down into the sub-basement. Abigail was curled in the corner of the dirt floor. She was completely covered in a fine layer of dust and cobwebs. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the ambient light from the kitchen above. She hadn't made a sound. She was shivering violently, her fibrous muscles locked in a state of absolute, sustained terror. Hollis dropped to his knees. He reached his flour-caked hand down into the darkness. He didn't yell. He didn't complain about the mess. He didn't mention the broken door or the ruined grain. "They're gone," Hollis whispered, his voice cracking. It was the softest he had spoken in years. "Come on up, kid. We have bread to bake." Fingers grasped his. Her skin was freezing again. The adrenaline crash had rapidly drained her core temperature, stripping the heat right out of her fibrous muscles. She pulled herself up from the sub-basement, her heavy joints popping loudly in the quiet room. She stood in the center of the kitchen. The gray fog was settling into a damp, sticky film on every exposed surface. Spilled rye crunched aggressively under her heavy military boots. She looked at the ruined bags of flour, the melted butter pooling near the disconnected freezer, and the deep, angry red blister forming along Hollis's right forearm where the superheated steam had clipped him. Abigail reached up. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the crude clasp of the rusted metal collar at her throat. The small green light flickered to life. "Cost," the machine buzzed. The synthetic word was perfectly flat, but the way she stared at the ruined supplies carried the immense weight of a physical blow. "Calculated loss. Too high." Hollis walked over to the deep sink. He turned the cold tap, letting the rusty water run until it cleared, then plunged his burned arm directly under the stream. He hissed violently through his teeth, closing his eyes as the freezing water bit into the raw, inflamed skin. "Flour sweeps up," Hollis muttered, staring at the chipped tile wall. "Butter can be clarified. It's just a mess, kid. Messes clean up. They will return." "Maybe," Hollis said, pulling his arm from the water and wrapping a clean, dry towel tightly around the burn. He leaned back against the deep sink, crossing his arms, finally meeting her solid black eyes. "But not tonight. Tonight, they think this place is a toxic respiratory hazard. Tomorrow, I'll pay a mechanic 2 blocks over to fabricate a fake work order for a busted steam valve. We buy time. That's all anyone does in this sector. We buy time." Abigail slowly lowered her head. She reached her hand deep into the pocket of her rotting canvas coat. Hollis tensed. "Put the medal away. I told you. The debt is—" She didn't place it on the table as a transaction. She walked over to the small, elevated shelf above the prep station, right next to a cracked ceramic jar where Hollis kept his oldest, most precious sourdough starter. It was the safest spot in the entire kitchen, isolated from the intense heat, the splashing moisture, and the chaotic foot traffic of the floor. She set the heavy osmium star down gently. She didn't push it toward him. "Not payment," the translator clicked softly. "Safekeeping, anchor." Hollis stared at the dark metal. It sat there, a brutal artifact of a lost, devastating war, resting quietly next to a jar of fermenting yeast. It was a bizarre, deeply jarring contrast. Death and life, sitting shoulder to shoulder on a cheap laminate shelf. He looked back at her. Her shoulders were pulled back. She wasn't fleeing anymore. She was claiming a space. Hollis gave a slow, exhausted nod. "Anchor, right. He grabbed a heavy, wide-bristle push broom from the wall bracket and tossed it to her. She caught the wooden handle out of the air without flinching. "Start with the dry flour," Hollis commanded, his voice dropping back into its familiar gruff cadence. "Don't let it touch the water from the boots, or it'll glue itself to the tiles and we'll be chiseling it off for a month. I'll salvage what's left in the torn bags." They went to work. The silence stretched out, but it was no longer the oppressive, suffocating silence of two strangers trapped in a bitter standoff. It was the functional, shared quiet of basic survival. Abigail swept the ruined grain into neat, methodical piles, her movements precise and heavily deliberate. Hollis dragged the torn 50-pound sacks to the metal prep table, scooping the uncontaminated rye into clean plastic storage bins. His lower back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. His lungs burned faintly from the lingering carbon smoke, but the violent, erratic hammering of his heart had finally settled back into a steady, rhythmic thump. By 3 in the morning, the kitchen was reset. It wasn't perfect. A faint, stubborn smell of burnt molasses clung to the porous ceiling tiles, and the floor held a dull, hazy sheen that no amount of mopping could fully erase. But it was functional. Hollis dragged the heavy wooden bench into the center of the room. He dumped a massive measure of salvaged rye onto the floured surface. He cracked eggs. He poured warm, salted water. He measured the yeast with absolute, unyielding precision. He stepped back. He looked at Abigail. She had taken off the heavy canvas coat, tossing it over a rusted folding chair in the corner. She stood in her tattered grey undershirt, her violet, heavily scarred arms dusted with a fresh layer of pale powder. She stepped up to the bench. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dense, sticky mass. Push, fold, turn. Her movements were entirely fluid now. The brutal, alien strength that could rip a man's jaw off was perfectly tempered, stretching the delicate gluten strands without tearing them. The low, rhythmic purr began to vibrate in her chest again, a steady, alien hum that harmonized perfectly with the low, mechanical rumble of the industrial ovens behind them. Hollis stood beside her, quickly scoring the resting loaves with his razor blade. Clack, clack. Outside, the chemical rain finally stopped. The harsh, sickly yellow neon of the open sign flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows across the flooded pavement of New Providence. The city was a brutal, dying machine, grinding its citizens into dust. It would take more than they had. It would inevitably demand blood and sweat and extortion. But inside the bakery, the air smelled of warm crust and blooming yeast. It smelled like tomorrow. Hollis wiped his flour-caked hands on his apron, watching the alien girl gently fold the dough. He wasn't a savior. He was just a baker, and they had bread to bake. If you felt the heat of those ovens and the crushing weight of that osmium metal, hit that like button and subscribe. Humanity isn't always found in grand, sweeping victories. Sometimes it's forged in the quiet, dangerous rebellion of sharing your last loaf of bread in a city that wants you dead. Drop a comment below. How far would you go to protect a stranger in the dark? Share this video with someone who loves gritty, grounded sci-fi, and ring that notification bell. We've got more stories from the rusted edges of the galaxy coming soon. Until next time, stay human.